Hello, this is Mike Sadlowski, CPS Science Coordinator, and we're here for another science show, and I'm going to show you two different phenomena that happened today. I'm down at Lake of the Ozarks State Park, and it rained last night, and yesterday it was about 62 degrees down here. So you've certainly seen fog before, but this is a pretty good fog, and we want to remind you why fog forms. Fog is simply a cloud that is close to the ground. It forms in the very same way the clouds are going to form up in the atmosphere, but it's closer to the ground. You may also know already, but we should review, that warm air holds a lot more water than cold air. And think about summer in Missouri. It is far more humid. It is very sticky. There's a lot of water vapor in the air in the summer compared to the winter when that air cannot hold that water. And that's why you go around your house and you're shocking people because the air is just so dry. Now, if the temperature did not fall overnight, we would have no fog today. So it rained and there's all this moisture near the surface and it wouldn't matter. That happens a lot. But because it was raining yesterday at about 61, 62 degrees, all that water could be contained as water vapor in the air. But overnight, the temperature dropped. And it finally dropped to the point where it could no longer hold all that moisture that was in the air. And it condenses out onto microscopic particles. Every cloud droplet is on some microscopic piece of dust or something in the atmosphere. It has to cling to something. And it did that near the surface. So it hit what's called its dew point. Its dew point is when the temperature drops to the point where it can no longer hold any more moisture. And that moisture comes out and condenses on these particles. So as we can see, we have a really, really deep fog here, which is really cool. Now I want to show you something else. All right, we're taking another look at Lake of the Ozarks. And again, this fog is no different than the fog we have at home. However, it is forming where there is more moisture in the atmosphere or right above the surface. Because if I turn around and look, it's a little hazy in the forest, but that forest does not contain near the water that is right above this lake. And so that fog forms. But there's another really interesting phenomena that's happening here. Look down, and this is not a pretty picture necessarily, but let's look down at the coast or the banks of this water. Well, there's my dog, Snickers. Doesn't seem to mind the cold water, but look at all these dead fish. What is going on here? The dog is insisting on getting in this video. Look at this. It goes on in the entire Lake of the Ozarks. Every bank has all of these dead fish everywhere. These fish are called shad, and they just keep going and going and going. And it's very disappointing. There's little bitty shad, and there's a little bit bigger shad, and they're just everywhere. And so what actually happened here, this is not a human-caused incident. So that's good news. This happened because of the polar vortex that came down. And that polar vortex really changed the temperature of this lake fast. Now, every winter, we get really cold. And these fish can handle temperatures to around 30, 32 degrees. And you may think, well, don't we get that cold every winter? Well, water changes its temperature very, very slowly compared to land. That's why it can be super cold for a few days. And while small puddles freeze, big lakes like this don't freeze at all. It takes quite some time. And think about putting water in your freezer. It takes quite a bit for the entire thing to freeze. It's a long time. Well, it happened this time. That polar vortex stayed for like 20 days, and it really put a thick layer of ice on the lake and fast. And so two things happened to make this worse. One, the temperature reached well below the point where these fish could survive. Now, normally, the fish would find deeper pools, and they would go down, and they very likely did that. But because the polar vortex lasted so long, many of them could not survive, and they don't have the fat reserves. They also can't come to the surface and get the food, that's the insects or the plankton that's floating on the surface, because it's frozen. So the little ones die first, and then the bigger ones die off. Many of them still survived, no doubt. They found deeper pools. but so many of these are killed. Now, if there's any good news, you will see as we walk around here that some of these fish look like, here we go, some of the fish are cut in half. Well, that's because before the fish made it to the bank, they were actually floating in ice water, and that ice water was preserving them, and birds, scavenger birds, would come and eat them. We actually had a half of a fish up on our deck on the 3rd floor that was half eaten, and a bird must have dropped that down. And so at least it's forming some food for others. But unfortunately, it's kind of a sad thing right now. But it will recover. There's a lot more shad in here, and this happens every few years, and it'll be okay. So I'm at another beautiful spot on an upland slope in the Ozark region, and this area is characterized by pretty shallow soil, and so it has a lot of rocks, and it's just a beautiful area, kind of an open forest with a lot of lichen and mosses growing. But I want to show you that while we talked about the shad that really suffered from our polar vortex, there are some other consequences that maybe aren't so bad. So what I found here is 9-banded armadillo, and you have certainly seen driving the highways around Missouri a lot of dead armadillo. These are coming up from Mexico in the southern United States. They are not really supposed to be, or I shouldn't say, they originally were not in our region. They wouldn't necessarily be called an invasive species because we didn't cause this, climate change caused this. They cannot handle the roughest winters. And so they do burrow, and they try to warm up and stay warm all winter. They don't hibernate, but they stay warm underneath the ground where the ground temperature stays above freezing most of the time. But the polar vortex we had this year was unique in the fact that it was super cold well before it snowed. Snow insulates the ground, and it actually keeps the ground from freezing very solid. It did snow, but more towards the back end of that polar vortex. And so the ground got very cold. And here, this is just an example. The armadillo is very destructive. It outcompetes some of our things. But again, I wouldn't call it an invasive species because we didn't, well, we caused climate change, but we didn't bring in the armadillo. They are advancing northward because our winters are not as cold, and they keep coming further and further north. And whenever there is a super cold winter for a long period of time, it shoves them back south again. And again, they don't travel south. It just kills off those at the northern fringe. So as I look here, I like the skeletons of armadillos because they're just so unique. They have so many very interesting patterns. And here's a portion of the skull of the armadillo. It's just a very strange animal. Now, what's going to be interesting to me this year is, do we see this spring and summer less armadillos dead on the side of the road? In other words, did a lot get killed off in place in the forest this winter? And I don't know the answer to that, but science would say probably. Will we be able to notice the difference? I don't know. We probably don't have the data of how many were dead beforehand on the roads. But I am wondering if that will have an impact. So while it hurt our shad population of the fish, it also knocked back the destructive armadillo. And they're destructive because they're out competing the same foods of our native, original native animals. So it might have shoved them a little further south, and that might help a little bit too.
Hi, my name is Liz Kalanda. I'm a student at Mizzou, and today I'll be addressing the question, can sunshine make you happier? I'll be doing this by looking at a recent scientific study on the effect of seasonal variations in sunlight on the brain. The study was conducted by a group of research scientists and involved both human volunteer subjects and rat test subjects. It took place in Finland, specifically at the Turku PET Center, and the results were published just a few weeks ago on February 10th, 2021. The objective of the study was to collect brain scans on test subjects in both the winter and the summer, and then compare those results to determine how the length of daylight hours affected special receptors in the brains of the test subjects. What the research scientists found was that the length of daylight hours do have a mood-regulating effect. Brain scans taken during the summer showed a positive correlation between increased daylight hours and an increase in mood. This was represented by a larger number of special activated receptors in the brain scans. In contrast, during the winter, the brain scans showed that decreased daylight hours showed more depressed moods, and this was represented by smaller numbers of special activated receptors in the brain scans. So these results are pretty interesting. One thing to consider if you find yourself feeling a little down in the winter is that your mood might be negatively influenced by the decreased levels of sunshine that we experience in the winter. The study results help scientists understand what is known as seasonal affective disorder. And according to the Mayo Clinic 2017, seasonal affective disorder, also known as SAD or SAD, is a type of depression that's related to changes in seasons. SAD begins and ends at about the same times every year. If you're like most people with SAD, your symptoms start in the fall and continue into the winter months, sapping your energy and making you feel moody. With that said, we are supposed to be having really beautiful and really sunny weather this week, so try and get out and enjoy the sun if you can.
Welcome back to the Weekly Owl Report. I'm Henry Grove. Early Wednesday, morning February 10th, after weeks of entering the box and scratching around, then leaving after a few minutes, she stayed for more than 3 hours. Normally, owls will roost in a tree when they sleep. So this change of behavior might mean...
Guess what?
Let's go over to Kaylee and Tatum for some owl box observations.
Thanks, Henry. We've had 5 nesting pairs at Owlbox 1 in the last 10 years. From what we've seen,
once eggs are laid, it takes about 4 weeks until they hatch.
Once they hatch, it will be another 4 weeks before they are big enough to leave the box.
That's 4 weeks of fast growth. Since they aren't strong flyers yet, the owlets climb around on tree trunks and branches. Interestingly, emergence from the box happens at the same time the trees are leafing out.
Live from Owlbox 1! That is interesting. Can owls predict when springtime comes? Stay tuned!
Hi, my name is Josh Wisdom. I'm with the Department of Conservation, and I was asked to talk to you today about one of my favorite subjects, which is bears here in Missouri. So I'm going to try and share my screen with you and kind of give you a quick little presentation I like to give folks here about bears. Kind of cutting to the point, in case you didn't know, we do have bears here in Missouri. We only have black bears. We don't have grizzly bears. Black bears in Missouri might be brown, they might be chocolate colored, they might be cinnamon colored, but they're all still black bears, Ursus americana. This picture here is a sow with a collar on and an ear tag, and it'd be on the right side of the bear there, and you see a cub standing there with her. This is a Missouri picture. This is down in southwest Missouri where I work. So kind of the history of black bears, originally, pre-European settlement, black bears were everywhere. They were super common, probably more common than deer are now. All the way back in the early 1800s, a gentleman named Schoolcraft, who you could do some research on him, was pretty interesting, but he was going across the state looking for mineral deposits, and he took a journal every day, and he talked about all the bears he saw and bison, and anyway, so that is a first-hand document that shows that in the early 1800s, bears were everywhere. They're real common. Things started to decline as people moved west. People started cutting down the forest. Our logging industry really changed Missouri's landscape. So things were just dramatically, bears had a hard time there for a long time. In the early 1900s, they were super rare, almost extirpated, which would be almost like think extinct, gone, didn't really know. There was very few. In the early 1920s, there was a flood in the southeast corner of the state, the Boot Hill, and they thought there might be still a few in there because that was so flooded and waterlogged, nobody had gotten in there. But then finally that flood came, and we think kind of pushed the last of them out or killed them either way. In the early 50s, there were a couple bears that were killed, and literally there were rumors that they may have been circus bears that fell off of a train. So who knows? However, in the late 50s, early 60s, Arkansas Game and Fish went to Minnesota and Manitoba, Canada, and they brought back 250, I think it's 254 bears over a number of years, and they reintroduced bears into Arkansas. This was a time before GPS collars. They weren't ear tagging them. They were literally just going north, grabbing bears, bringing them home in trucks to Arkansas and letting them go and hoping for the best. There really wasn't, data being recorded, all the locations where they were being dropped off. It was a very different time in wildlife management. So these bears were, 254 bears I see there now, were released in Arkansas. And that was really a springboard that really helped build back and get the population going in what now covers Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. In 1990, we started having some serious, legitimate bear sightings in Missouri, where this was also kind of before trail cameras were popular. Cell phones weren't really that popular back then. Well, actually, cell phones weren't at all in 1990. But my point was everybody didn't have a camera with them all the time. And so you never knew if it was just a big dog or what. So that's kind of our timeline on bears right there. So black bears in Missouri, they are becoming more common. We believe our population is growing 9% every year. The range is expanding. They're moving farther north. Our bear population is growing. Our latest estimate, our latest data shows that we have between 540 and 840 animals here in Missouri. We have bears now that live here their whole life that are adults. Bears can live, up to 20 years in the wild. And so we've got bears that live their whole life here in Missouri. They're not just walking up from Arkansas. They're reproducing, they're having generations and generations. And so it's a pretty interesting time to be a Missourian. Our nuisance complaints are also starting to go up. It's becoming more common, almost commonplace in some places now. And we are scheduled to possibly have our first bear hunt in 2021, which would be next fall. So this map here shows the red line there on the bottom third of the state is really the heart of Missouri's bear range right now. These dots are, they show you by year kind of like locations where we had sightings from people, photographs, things like that. So that red line right in the middle, the western side would be like Springfield, and it goes over to about Poplar Bluff. That would really be the heart of Missouri's bear range. And these blue lines are these expanding areas. The blue line there, kind of in the middle, is going around like Lake of the Ozarks. You're also starting to get some expansion going up towards St. Louis, like through Washington County. And yes, you see some dots way up in northern Missouri. Maybe those are bears, maybe they're not. Not every sighting is necessarily verified. So talk a little bit about biology. When you talk about bears, you can't help but talk about food, and we'll jump into that, and we'll also talk a little bit about denning. But bears will come out of their dens. Usually, I've had my first nuisance complaints April 1st. So, the end of March, early April, you'll start having bears come out of their dens. Yearlings, bears will stay with their mother for about the first year and a half of their life. And after that, the males get kicked off, and the girls will kind of be next door neighbor with mom. They won't be best friends, but they'll kind of tolerate each other. But the males will have to go far, far away. And so the breeding season is also in June, and I'll show a graph on that later. The late summer, early fall is when a thing called hyperphagia kicks in, and they really start eating all the time, 20 hours a day, 20,000 calories a day. That's how that bear gets that fat, that stereotype of a big fat bear eating all the time. That really kicks in the fall. And then, of course, in the late fall and winter, they're usually denning. So try to make some sense out of this graphic here. In June is when you would call the rut. It's when male bears will breed female bears. That's the peak of activity for that is in June. Again, the summertime is when the young male bears get dispersed away from their mothers, which is also, that's why, so she can get bred again. And the larger male bears will actually harm the smaller male bears. And so it's for their own good that they run away from their mother at that time. So with that show, so for my job, I deal with a lot of nuisance complaints, nuisance issues with bears. June, July, August, I have a lot of problems. You've got male bears that are small, that are out on their own for the first time, getting into trouble. You've got bears running around like crazy, trying to breed and trying to put fat on for the winter. And so it's a very busy time in the bear world in the summertime. That hyperphagia will start there around September, October, which again, that's when they're eating all the time. It's a full-time job just to eat, put fat on. In November, December, that's when you'll start having your bears go into the den. Your female bears that are pregnant, the ones that got bred, will be the first one in the den. January, most cubs are born. I usually just say January 1st because it's easy to remember. That's not necessarily true, but anywhere in January, we'll start usually doing den checks in February and March, and as they're coming out in the spring. So I've kind of made a chart here about a hunger cycle. This is just a way I try to explain it. If a bear is in the den in January, it's asleep. If a bear is in the den in February, it's asleep. As they start to come out in March and April, when things are just now starting to green up in the spring, there's not that much for them to eat, which again leads to problems. They're starting to find food wherever they can. So the fewest foods are available. They haven't eaten in months, really. So there's kind of an initial uptake of them trying to eat a lot to get ready to breed. As breeding happens in June, that's kind of the point of the story there. After they're bred, it's a full-time job. I have nothing else. They have nothing else to do except try to gain weight so they can go back into the den. And that's the point I'm trying to show with this red line is that, after that breeding, all they're concerned about is food. Just eat, eat, eat. How much can I eat? How fast can I get it? What has the most caloric value? What has the most fat will put on my body? So again, natural foods, which it's not a coincidence, whatever. In the fall, when acorns start to drop, acorns in southern Missouri are a big driving food source for bears. And so it's a good time to really try to put on those calories, put on those pounds, because, hey, in September is when all those acorns really start to fall.
Hello, everyone. In a past science show, Liz talked about the science behind the COVID-19 vaccination. And well, as more and more of the population gets vaccinated, maybe you've heard the term herd immunity thrown around, or maybe you're wondering, like the rest of us, when life is going to get back to normal. Herd immunity, as it's sometimes called community immunity, which is super fun to say, happens when enough people in a population are immune to an infectious disease that the spread from person to person of that disease is unlikely. So with COVID-19, herd immunity will be reached once enough people in the population are immune to COVID, either from being infected with it in the past or from getting the vaccine for it. The percentage of the population that is necessary for reaching herd immunity depends on how the disease spreads and how contagious it is. But experts estimate that for COVID-19, herd immunity could be reached when about 70 to 90% of the population has either been infected with the disease or has gotten the vaccine for it. When this percentage is reached, the other 10 to 30% of the population that is not immune to COVID is also much better protected from catching the disease. This simulation from NPR shows why. I'm going to run the simulation a couple of times, and then I encourage you to pause the video and talk with someone next to you about what the simulation is showing us. These boxes show scenarios of different percentages of people immune to COVID-19 in a population. The light gray hexagons show healthy people, the dark gray hexagons show vaccinated people, and the coral colored hexagons show infected people. You'll see that when 75% of the population is immune to COVID, then when infection does happen, it kind of gets trapped in its own little bubble instead of spreading throughout the rest of the population. So immune people kind of work as a barrier that stop the disease from spreading. Here's another way to look at it, as well as a further discussion as to why it's important.
Herd immunity is especially useful for protecting members of the population who can't be vaccinated, perhaps because they're too old, too young, or have vulnerable immune systems. If they're surrounded by people who have received the vaccine, then that can protect them from infection. If, however, people forgo vaccination, then the herd can no longer protect these people. This means that the population as a whole can be vulnerable to outbreaks.
So, although we're still pretty far away from reaching that herd immunity benchmark or reaching any kind of normal as we're used to it, we sure are closer to it than we were around this time last year, largely thanks to new vaccines. That's why vaccines are important, not only for your health and safety, but for the health and safety of your loved ones and strangers in the community.